Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first event in QQI's Rethinking Assessment Masterclass series, which is about enhancing understanding and expertise in a variety of dimensions of assessment relevant to contexts and fields of study across the tertiary education sector. Today's session is on rethinking assessment feedback, which we know from both practitioners and learners can be tricky to get right. We have had a lot of registrations for this webinar from right across the tertiary education sector, which I think really illustrates the enormous appetite for and interest in sharing experiences, troubleshooting and developing good practice in this area. And we're really pleased to have someone of the caliber of Professor Phillip Dawson to share his perspectives on this topic. Just have a little bit of housekeeping before we start. Just to note that the webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to the QQI YouTube channel in the next week or so. And we hope to have some time at the end of the session for questions. So if you'd like to submit a question for Phil, you should hopefully see at the top of your screen a Q&A option, and we'll take as many of those as we have time for towards the end. So I'll now hand over to the QQI Chief Executive, Dr. Boud Walsh, to introduce our speaker for today.
And thanks for the introduction, Roisin. It's a great pleasure to introduce our the first webinar in our Rethinking assessment series. There's been a real and very welcome focus on assessment challenges in Irish tertiary education recently. As we all know, the issue of assessment came under considerable scrutiny during the recent COVID experience and continues to be challenged by developments in academic integrity, including, I suppose, more recently, the new large language models that have given rise to generative AI tools such as ChatGPT and Google Bard. Well, these developments have been challenging. They've also obviously provided opportunities to review and evaluate our current practices. And I think we've seen already some innovative and creative thinking on how we can address some of the challenges that we face. QQI's core statutory quality assurance guidelines devote an entire chapter to learner assessment, and we recognise within that chapter the importance of the provision of assessment feedback to learners and our expectation that providers will ensure that this is delivered in a timely and appropriate manner. We do, however, recognise that therein remain many challenges, particularly when dealing with larger cohorts of learners. So it's a real pleasure to welcome to Ireland Professor Phillip Dawson of the Centre for Research in the Assessment of Digital Learning, or CRADLE, at Deakin University in Australia, to provide the benefit of his expertise in this area. For many of you, Phil will need no introduction, as he's very well known and respected in the whole area of assessment. And I know he has previously delivered a seminar as part of the NAIN National Academic Integrity Network academic series on digital security. These webinars are designed to stimulate, challenge, and get us all thinking. And I'm confident that Phil's webinar will do just that. So again, thank you very much to Phil for the insights you're going to share and expertise you're going to share with us. And over now to you.
Thank you so much, Porrig and Roisin. It's a joy to be here with you and also to be speaking with you all in Ireland. I know it's through a webcam, but it's not like super late at night or super early in the morning for me. So that's really, really fun. I'm on day 2 of being in Dublin, but I'm very adjusted to the time zones because I've been in London for a week. I'm going to just share some slides now. So I will share this here. And I know people are going to let me know if they can't see slides. So, yeah, I'm Phil. I'm from CRADLE at Deakin University in Melbourne. We're a research centre. We focus on assessment and digital learning. So feedback's really core to what we do. You'll see down in the bottom right, there's a URL, feedbackforlearning.org. That's a project where we have a whole bunch of resources about how to do feedback well in higher and tertiary education. That came out of an Office for Learning and Teaching funded project that we had a while back. We now currently also have an Australian Research Council project that will sort of build even more and newer stuff. One of the key things you'll note is these little cartoons. I've got one of them there. We had a political cartoonist, Simon Kneebone, come and join us, and he produced all these little cartoons. And a piece of advice I can give you all, next time you're doing up a budget for a project, see if you can include a line item for a cartoonist. You might think that's really hard to justify, but they're just able to get across the ideas that you have so much better. We had Simon sit in our meetings with us, and then he drew a bunch of cartoons that you'll see throughout. My Twitter handle there, @Phillip Dawson, is where you'll find me on Twitter. So please tag me when you're tweeting about this. Okay. I want to talk about three things in this presentation. Firstly, that there's been a shift in what we think about as effective feedback. Secondly, we're going to think about what do feedback literate students do, and we'll go into what specifically that is, and then what feedback literate educators do. But I want to throw it over to you first. I'd really like to hear from you. What are the problems with feedback? So in the chat, please put in your thoughts on the problems with feedback. So what's the problem? Why are we here? Wrong time. Yeah. Feedback information can come to students when they don't need it. Timeliness really matters. I want to put a little fine point on timeliness. It's not so much about you must receive feedback 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever the policy says after you do the work. Timeliness of feedback matters about when you get it in relation to your next bit of work. We've got a lot of problems with feedback. There's time consuming. It certainly is. When I was at a previous university, we did a bit of sort of accounting analysis of what the cost of marking and feedback was, and we figured it was roughly 40% of the teaching and learning budget was marking and feedback. And this worked out to be in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Time consuming, the time to create it, that it's not taken on board. We know this is a really big problem with feedback. The amount of times we tell students a piece of feedback information again and again and again over the course of a program of study, and it's not taken on board and there's no change. Students not even reading it. There's been some work done on student access of feedback on learning management systems, and it finds that there's an enormous rate of students not accessing the feedback, let alone reading it. As a little bit of homework, I encourage you to have a look at your learning management system and see if you can find out what proportion of feedback comments ever get read by students. I've had people do this, and it's very sad. Sometimes most or the overwhelming majority of feedback that's written by staff is never read. Not coming at the right time, little or no impact, recording it correctly, overly general feedback. We did a large-scale survey of 5,000 students across 2 universities in Australia, and that was one of the things that they said. Yeah, we're getting feedback that's general, that's generic feedback. They wanted personal feedback. We then had a focus group with students, and I said, there's this thing coming up in the survey where people want more personalised feedback. What does that mean? And the students said, feedback where it shows that the marker has actually read my work. They weren't sure that had actually happened. Rarely time to turn it into a conversation. Yeah, there's this sort of desire for dialogic feedback, but where does that come? Students not recognising that it's feedback. Now, I have mixed feelings about this one. I think we do need to educate students on what feedback is and work with them around that. However, there's also been a version of this comment of we're getting low scores in the National Survey of Student Satisfaction, whatever your country's particular one is, we all have them. I can only speak to the Australian and the UK ones and say that feedback is an area of consistent dissatisfaction. So then the approach is we'll tell students when we're giving them feedback, we'll use the word feedback a lot as a desire to improve scores on that survey. Now, it may improve scores on the survey, but it won't improve feedback. So it's like, what are we trying to improve? Feedback or the measure of feedback? I'd really hope we're not all here just for the measures. I'm scrolling through, I'm seeing a lot of sort of confirmation about some of the things that other people have said. The quality and language of the feedback, that it can be unclear. Students do report they sometimes don't know what to do with it. It's not always formative. That's a really interesting one. So I know that in Australia we provide percentage weightings to different tasks throughout a module. This first formative assessment might be worth 10%, and this later summative assignment at the end might be worth 60%. And we have this habit of apportioning our feedback time to in proportion with those percentages. So we spend 10% of our feedback time on the first formative task and 60% on the last task, whereas actually we'd be better off reversing those, because the time when students can make the most of it, that formative time, is at the start on that 10% task, not at the end on the 60%. My co-director of CRADLE, David Boud, will sometimes say that for the final summative task, if it's purely summative, our feedback comments should focus on justifying the grade and not on providing sort of formative information. We should spend the time on formative information at the start when it can really make a difference. Disconnect between what is intended and what is received by students. There certainly can be a real communication mismatch there often. How much is enough or too much? It can be hard. I think sometimes I look at feedback students have received, and an assessor has written fundamentally the same thing all throughout, rather than on the first page saying in detail, here's a particular thing that you need to improve and here's how to improve it. And now I want you to go throughout the rest of the paper and find the instances where that feedback could be applied. Not being in the class in the first place, so many students. It goes on. We have a lot of problems with feedback. There's an interesting one here about online feedback, students rejecting verbal discussion in favour of online written responses. Yeah, that's interesting. The research I've read suggests students seem to appreciate sort of mixed modes like recorded audio or video or screencast feedback more than written feedback. That's not to say it's better. There's, to my knowledge, not evidence that these various innovative modes of feedback are more effective than written feedback, but there does seem to be an appreciation of that. So it's interesting that unknown user is finding that. Doesn't land, student feedback literacy, the score rather than the commentary is the student focus. This is quite a common phenomenon that when students get a grade and feedback comments at the same time, they pay all of their attention to the grade and discard this written feedback comments. There's been some work done where there was sort of staggered release of the feedback comments and the grade. So get the feedback comments now and get the grade 2 weeks later. And in that sort of approach, students pay much more attention to the feedback comments. Not all colleagues doing it, especially in creative practice. There's real inconsistency with how we do feedback, and it makes it really hard for students to get used to this is the way that feedback is here. There's a comment here that feed forward is important too. I mentioned my co-director, David Boud. If you use the word feed forward around Dave, you almost get in trouble. The view of our centre is that feedback should be about what you can do in the future. Feedback should be connected to future tasks. Feedback shouldn't be something you get and you just ignore. And if we say that feedback is this, we don't have need for a term called feed forward. And using the term feed forward suggests that not all feedback has to feed forward. Now, there's some great work by, I believe it's Kay Samble, Nicola Ryman, some other people, that talks about how, well, yeah, feed forward might be a problematic term, but it's associated with a lot of really useful feedback practices. So maybe it's a useful term for us to use. I don't know whether it's that useful to get caught up in the definitions, but we shouldn't let feedback off the hook of having to connect to future work. I'm scrolling through. Feedback on group work is its own thing. Yeah, I think group work assessment is a hugely difficult, problematic sort of area. The feedback needs to be completed by an assessor outside of a classroom as opposed to a lecturer giving the class content and feedback. It's interesting. We tend to not use class time for formal feedback processes, which is really interesting. When I used to teach computer science, which is now going back a little while, I've moved to education, but when I used to teach it about 20 years ago, it was our standard practice to spend our lab classes doing reviews of student code and giving feedback on their assignments. And that's just what we did in class. It was also what we did to try and address contract cheating, because we were concerned students weren't doing the work themselves. And we thought, what better thing to do for educative and integrity purposes than chat with students about their work? Can raise anxiety? Absolutely. We can ignore the affective dimension of feedback too often at our and our students' peril. My gosh, we are almost at the end of these amazing things that you've mentioned. And a focus on assessment of learning rather than assessment for learning can lead to a deficit in opportunities for feedback also. It really can. I think we need to be clear what we're doing. The assessment for learning movement has made so many great strides that there's almost this idea that we're always doing assessment for learning. But I like David Carlis's definition of assessment for learning in his book, Scaling Up Assessment for Learning, where he says assessment for learning is assessment that privileges the learning purposes of assessment. And we do that sometimes, but sometimes we privilege the certification purposes of assessment. In those moments where we are doing assessment for learning, let's put our feedback resources in there. And in our moments where we're doing assessment of learning, let's really try to help students understand how we came to that determination of their capability. You all keep adding more interesting, wonderful things into this. I have a presentation to get through, but I've got to say what you're putting into the chat is so useful and interesting. But I'm going to go on to bit of a provocation here on the slides. And this is a provocation from Dylan William, that feedback should be more work for the recipient than it is for the donor. And I don't think that's true very often in higher education. I think too often we put a lot of work into feedback comments that either go nowhere or are just quickly scrolled through. There's not that kind of deep engagement by students with feedback. We need to flip this. We need to focus more on what are students doing with feedback rather than what are we doing. Because there has been a shift in what we think of as effective feedback. In the old days, we thought of our job as providing really useful comments to students, or even just really good comments to students. That we would load up the feedback cannon and blast it off to students, and that's it. That it's just about writing a good comment. But there's a shift now towards more of a process view of feedback. And here we've got a definition. There are many definitions. This is one of them, where feedback is a process in which learners make sense of information about their performance and use it to enhance the quality of their work or learning strategies. So this privileges the processes students do. It's a process definition. It's about learners using the comments to enhance both the quality of their work, the stuff they do, and also their learning strategies. And if we go to work by, for example, John Hattie and colleagues, there's this idea that if we're targeting our feedback comments, there's different levels we can target our feedback comments. And yes, it's effective to target the work, but it's really effective to target the sort of self-regulation processes that students use. So feedback's not just about the work and improving the work, it's about improving the learning strategies and the processes. On the side there, you'll see a little bit of a Google Trends search, and you'll see there's growing interest over time in what is feedback. Now, you might come on board with me in a redefinition of feedback to be a process rather than a product, or you might not. You might think, Phil, why do we need to redefine such a commonly used word? And that's totally okay. But what I would like you to come along with me on is a journey where we focus on what students do in the feedback process. Because I think we can all acknowledge that if you get feedback comments and you don't look at them, there's no effect, there's no benefit. And we really want to be focused there, not just on the quality of the comments that we give. So in that view, there's no feedback here. I left feedback on their final essays, which they'd ever collected. That's not feedback in a process-centric view, and it's a wasted weekend if you think of it in the view of feedback as a product. I'm sure we've all had either those paper piles of assignments in an office or the electronic equivalent where it was just never looked at. That's a tragedy that we resource that so much and that it goes nowhere. In this view, we want to focus on effective feedback rather than good feedback. So effective feedback requires effects. It requires change. It is tautological, I understand, but we want to focus on feedback that makes a difference, effective feedback, rather than just writing a good message that never gets looked at. So that's the shift that there has been. Now, to enable this shift to happen, we need to focus on developing student capabilities in feedback, sort of feedback literacy. And I want to throw over to you. In an ideal world, what should students do when they receive feedback information? Write in the chat. Think about it. Read it with many exclamation marks, because we've been in the situation where they didn't read it. Act on it. Do something about it. If we're in a process view, it's all about student activity. Own it. Yeah. Own the process. Own the comments. Take a constructive approach to it. It's a big ask, but yes, I agree with you. I want students to take a constructive approach to it rather than, say, a defensive approach. Read it, act on it, reflect. Yeah, apply it. Think about, how does this apply to my work here? We've got a lot of reflect. Apply it next time is really good, because ideally, when they get these comments now, yeah, they're useful for this task, but for the next task that they do, they're hopefully even more useful. And for future tasks that they might do, they might want to look back at the feedback they've received on previous tasks. Process it and use it to revise drafts or for future assignments. Yeah, the processing is really interesting. I have an approach where when I get feedback comments, I turn it into a list of to-dos. And this is partly because I find the affective side of feedback really difficult. When I get feedback comments from someone I really respect, gee, that's hard. Gee, it's hard. I just struggle a bit. But when I rewrite it so it's no longer them being disappointed in me and my work, which is how it's my maladaptive view on it. When I rewrite it into Phil's to-do items on how he can make his work better, the affective side isn't as hard. So that's my processing. Question it, yes. There's sometimes a view that, if students were more feedback literate, then they'd act on all of our feedback. They'd take it all on board. Well, no, I actually think if students were excellent with feedback, they'd reject some of our feedback, but they would consciously, actively reject it. They wouldn't just ignore it. Question it, try to apply it. Approach it with the same conviction as writing the original piece of work. That's really neat. I like that framing. Because certainly, we as professionals produce work, get comments from our peers, make it better. The job's not done when you make the first draft and show it to a colleague. In a lot of times when I'm producing something, that's not even when most of the work is done. Most of the work lies down the road when I'm revising things based on the views of stakeholders and colleagues and others. Generate a plan for the future from it, yes. Ask about it, discuss it, develop strategies. Apply it to the task at hand and those going forward, reading it, understanding how it maps to what they submitted. Do something with it. Reread the relevant assignment and see how it relates to that. Yeah, sometimes it's been so long since we produced the thing that we can forget it. Ask what it means. Yeah, actually go and ask for clarification. Decide whether they should adjust their work appropriately and then make those changes or not. Yes, definitely that sort of connoisseurship of the feedback. Revisit once starting the next assignment. Yes. See feedback as an act of love. Yeah. There's sort of a mindset of thinking that the feedback provider has my best interests at heart that I think students don't always have. They can see us as attacking them rather than helping them. Holistic view of all feedback rather than each piece in isolation. Yes, because students receive conflicting feedback. In focus groups, I've talked with students who have said, well, I write in this way for this academic and this way for this other academic, and they're contradictory ways because I know what each one wants. Now, that's a fairly dysfunctional pattern that we've got as educators, but students who want to be effective with feedback and then later on in the world of work and society more broadly, they need to know how to give people what they want, sadly, or how to challenge and change that. Treat feedback like a gift. Take it or pass it. Yeah. You don't always have to hang every piece of art that you receive from someone in your house. You don't have to act on every single piece of feedback. Yeah, we've got a whole bunch of really useful practices here. Now, I got another question for you, which is what do you do? Now, this is you, the real person, not you, some imagined version of yourself. What do you do when you receive feedback information? It could be feedback about your teaching. It could be feedback from a paper you submitted for peer review. It could be feedback in some other sort of professional context. What do you do? Great, we've got reflecting on it. That's somewhat common with what we said the students would do, try to understand it and use it, reflecting, evaluate it, question it, start a dialogue, redraft, welcome it. You're all very, oh wait, we have our first actual human sort of response. Emotional response first, then sit with it and finally act on it. Yeah, on really high stakes things, I can sometimes need to go on a walk around the block after looking at the feedback and then put it away. Oh, as Mary's saying, put it away for a day and come back to it. Absolutely. Discuss it with the person who provided it. Yeah. Take it personally, attach emotion to something that I shouldn't. Yeah, it's hard. Ask myself, do I understand this? Agonize over it. Make sure you regulate your emotions and then first figure out if you understand it, reflect, provide feedback on the feedback. Ask questions, seek additional clarification. The regulating emotions part is a real challenge. Easily written, harder to do. Read, revisit, skip straight to the negative. Oh, yes, this is a thing, isn't it? There's sometimes we use the feedback sandwich, which a lot of the literature would say is not actually a great move. But we think that if we tell someone something nice and then give them the real critique and then tell them something nice, that the real critique won't hit as hard. But as Elaine has said here, People skip straight to the negative. We know this ritual. We've seen this before. Alternatively, there are some people who get feedback sandwiched and then they go, oh, well, the assessor mostly said nice things about my work, so my work must be okay. So feedback sandwich can be kind of confusing or just not that useful. Prepare emotionally. Yeah, think to yourself before you open it, what am I going to do? Depends on the impact of the consequence. Read it, leave it, read it again. Can I apply it? Does it make sense? Stay objective. If the feedback is very poor, go through the 5 stages. Denial, anger, bargaining, be depressed, and then eventually accept it. Yeah. And then as long as it's constructive, I can get over the emotional fairly quickly. So we've got a lot of different approaches. I have a question for you now, which is, how did you learn to act in this way? So you've described some pretty human things, but also some quite appropriate, maybe even aspirational strategies, things we want students to do. How did you learn to do feedback that way? How did you learn to cope with it so well? So we've got parents. Absolutely, parents do shape how we deal with feedback, both in terms of how they deal with it, like modelling, but also they can give us explicit instruction. And there's a great book called Thanks for the Feedback by Stone and Heen. Really good book, really strong recommendation. It's not an education book, it's more of a business sort of book, but it's about how to deal with feedback better. And they talk about relationship systems as being really core to how we do feedback. In that book, they would really say that sort of the parental relationship can really develop a lot. Age, yes, we have age, we have experience. Being taught in school, that's, I'd say, somewhat of a rarity, having asked this question to a lot of people, but wonderful that you were. The more feedback you get, the easier it gets. Peer feedback, experience, practice. Yeah, having a lot of experience. Seeing the impact of implementing change following feedback, we are rewarded each time we use feedback, so we get more okay about using it. Becoming someone who gives a lot of feedback. Yeah, seeing yourself on the other side of this is really helpful. You know, that first time that you sat down and graded student work and wrote feedback comments, I don't know about you, but it led to so many aha moments for me. And I did that marking with such a sort of optimistic and generous and full heart that I didn't know that my markers had for me prior to doing that. Thanks to my close friends for telling me I smell. Now I wash more often. I don't feel like I need to comment on that one, but I'm glad your friends told you that. The assumption is that the people giving feedback are benign and capable, but in reality, we've all had teachers and bosses who are neither benign nor capable. So we have a learned behaviour to treat it with a pinch of salt. Absolutely. When working on feedback literacy, and at the moment we're working on a 4-year longitudinal project developing student feedback literacy through to in the workplace. And yeah, we don't want to develop people who just naively take on everything and assume everyone has their best interests at heart. And Sarah's saying that it was a Quaker school with most teachers gave very individual and nuanced feedback. That's very heartening. I'm a Quaker, so that's really lovely to hear. So we've got a bunch of different ways that you learned. I'd love to say a way that I learned. When I received my first student feedback comments on my work, so I was teaching, it was my first time teaching in higher ed. I got student feedback, student evaluations, and my PhD supervisor sat down with me and read through every single student feedback comment and had a conversation with me about them and helped me learn about how to cope with those. So I can tell you, when I get student evaluation comments, I don't just zoom in on the negative and obsess about those for days and days like I've observed some of my colleagues do. I think I would be predisposed to doing that. I know enough about myself, but I was taught another way. And I think we don't do enough of that mentoring about how to deal with feedback. Now, what we've been talking about is basically feedback literacy. Understandings, capacities, dispositions needed to make sense of information and use it to enhance work or learning strategies. There's a great model here by Carlos and Boud, which is their sort of 2018, might be 2019 now. I didn't update. No, it is 2018. Their model in this paper, 4 components. They talk about appreciating feedback, which is kind of double meaning. It includes sort of a connoisseurship of feedback. You know, this is useful, this is not. And also a thank you for the feedback, sort of appreciation. Making judgments. Which of this feedback is useful? Which is not? Which is credible? Which isn't? What's actionable? Managing affect. I'd say now we'd probably say making productive use of emotions, because we really see emotions in feedback not as something we need to keep a lid on and push down, but as something that can be quite productive and generative. And really looking to work like Pekrun, that's Pekrun, Pekrun's work on sort of activating and deactivating emotions. So having negative emotional responses to feedback isn't always a bad thing, just as having positive emotional responses to feedback isn't always a good thing. If the positive emotional responses to feedback are deactivating and make us not want to go and improve the work, that's not necessarily great for learning. But negative emotional responses that make us go, well, I feel bad about my work not being up to scratch, I better pull my socks up and get in there and do it. That's a negative emotional response that's quite activating. And then taking action, doing something. So this is feedback literacy in that model. Now, a big thing we've got to do if we want to develop student feedback literacy is work on what we do as educators. And there's been work recently on teacher feedback literacy, and I'll go into that now. I'm doing a little aside because some of the things we think are going to improve feedback literacy don't necessarily do it. I talked feedback sandwiches before, so I won't go into those again. But we sometimes, when I have conversations with educators about let's work on improving student feedback literacy, they say, all right, I'm going to train the staff on how to write good feedback comments. That's not it though. That won't in and of itself improve student feedback literacy. A feedback literate student is someone who's able to deal with not very great comments and work on it. And the approaches we use to develop student feedback literacy aren't just giving them really wonderful, easy to digest comments. It's perhaps in a scaffolded and supported way, letting them have access to comments that aren't very useful. Because when they leave us, they need to go into the world where feedback can be hard. I once spoke with a counsellor at a university who was responsible for one of the big mindfulness apps. And he actually did work with students on helping them cope with a certain type of feedback that they use in architecture, which is the CRIT. So people in architecture get a piece of work out and they all heap criticism on it and talk about it in a big group. And students were leaving this crying. They were having the worst time. The problem was when they got out into the world of architecture, they then faced exactly the same thing, exactly the same horrible experience. So for him, this counsellor, it wasn't about removing the affective challenge of the experience. It was about providing students with the capability to get through it and be there in the moment and learn, but feel the emotions and let them wash. So to work on how we can help educators improve student feedback literacy, we've been working on teacher feedback literacy. Dave Boud and I, Dave's my co-director of CRADLE, we worked on this teacher feedback literacy framework. We looked at data from 2 large-scale Australian projects on assessment and feedback and identified what educators who did feedback well were doing. We came up with 19 different competencies that existed across 3 levels. At the top level were the things that educators did around developing programs of study, because you do things there around feedback that you might not be aware of, that those are still working on feedback, because we focus often on that bottom level, the micro. When we think we're working on feedback, that's when we're writing comments. But no, Dave and I found that actually people were doing things across these 3 different levels. I'm going to focus today on that meso level. This is what you do when you're designing a module and implementing it, and thinking about the feedback loops that might exist across it. So it was these particular meso ones that we're going to focus on today. You can find the paper. The paper is open access. Don't feel like you've got to zoom in on this. These slides will come out to you if you want to see things. What I think educators really need to focus on at that meso level is these 4 things. Firstly, focusing less on what the teacher says or writes. In Australia, the work of John Biggs has been quite influential. Biggs is responsible for constructive alignment and some other ideas, but there's a 1999 paper called What the Student Does. And to me, it was quite transformative, because it says, rather than focusing on what teachers do in teaching and learning, if you're giving a lecture, you focus on, well, what am I saying? You focus on what are students doing, because it's only students who can do the learning. The same thing applies to feedback. We need to focus less on what comments we write and what we say to students. We need to focus more on what are they doing. We need to focus less on the phrasings or whatever that we do in feedback, which is not to say they're not important, they are. But we need to focus on how do students interpret those and how do students act on them. We need to view feedback as a teaching and learning activity. It's totally okay to ditch a couple of weeks of class content and have those weeks of class devoted to feedback. This may be hard for you to get away with. In our feedback for learning page, we've got case studies of educators who have done exactly this in a variety of disciplines, in really crammed in courses, because feedback is a teaching and learning activity. And we need to focus on building assessment sequences that incorporate feedback loops at the very least. If students get feedback comments on task 1, they need to have a way to use those in task 2. That needs to be expected of them. If they aren't, it's unlikely there's going to be any uptake. Now, I've got a feedback design example. I'm going to whiz through this fairly quickly because we've had some really wonderful discussion so far, and it's used some of our time together. But this is an example of a course, of a module that I taught. The students were higher education teachers. It was a postgrad academic practice certificate. It had a flipped mode. Students could choose face-to-face or online. There were 3 assessment tasks, a literature synthesis, feedback from students and peers about their teaching, so they had to gather that, and then a portfolio. The feedback design is that feedback was incorporated into the tasks, and this is a totally authentic thing to do. Feedback exists in the authentic world of practice of all of our students, so it's okay for seeking feedback to be part of our tasks. They sought formative peer feedback on their work, and they also did this process of comparing the teacher's assessment and student self-assessment. I'm going to go into this in a little more detail. Firstly, incorporating feedback seeking into the task. So students were required to seek feedback as part of the task. We provided scaffolds, which were peer observation forms and feedback survey questions. If you're asking students to go out into the world and request feedback, they need scaffolds and support. It's not a skill set everyone has. The main focus of the task was on analysing those feedback comments and making a plan for how to address them. We also worked on comparing teacher assessment and student self-assessment. When I teach, I use rubrics. We have to use rubrics at my institution. And when I use rubrics, I require students to self-assess on a copy of the rubric. I then assess them on a separate copy of the rubric, and I only provide detailed comments where the judgment differs, where I think something different to them. It's a mandatory part of the task. The task is not complete if they submit without the self-assessment. Now, this comparison is all about developing students' evaluative judgment, developing their understanding of what quality work is. That's a real goal for feedback. It also means I'm not saying your work is bad and you know why it's bad. There's no use to that. And it also means the comments I do give are the most useful ones for them. And we incorporate class time into seeking feedback and actually doing peer feedback in class. My students were quite advanced learners, so I let them run this class. I want to make one sort of final comment on feedback design versus feedback comments. If you invest your time, especially in large classes, on improving your feedback designs, maybe trying some of those things like get students to self-assess and then you assess and compare judgments, that scales really well. I'm a former computer scientist. We love talking about scalability of systems. Investing in writing better comments and more time on comments, for me in my context, is infeasible. But investing in systems and designs is really feasible. So my final suggestions for you. Firstly, focus more on effective feedback and less on good feedback. Secondly, spend more effort on feedback design and less on feedback comments. Thirdly, focus on what students do in feedback. So require them to make requests. You know, like, I'm not sure if you have this experience, but sometimes a colleague will send me something and say, Phil, can you give me some feedback on this? My first email back to them is, what would you like me to give you feedback on? Please be more specific with your feedback request, because I want to spend my time in a way that really helps them. However, with students, they submit work to us and it's up to us to decide what feedback comments are going to be most useful to them. We need to get in the habit of requiring students to make specific feedback requests, not just because it's going to help them in this task, but because it lets them develop that sort of feedback-seeking behaviour, that set of capabilities. Now, that term feedback-seeking behaviour comes from the business and management literature. There's a whole really useful literature in organisational psychology around how do we help people to become really good seekers of feedback in the world of business. And I think that literature exists to an extent because we do such a bad job of it in preparing students for that world. We want to share what we do in our feedback practices. In the work I've done on helping people improve assessment and feedback, most of the things that really helped people improve their practices was not presentations like this, and it wasn't the peer-reviewed literature, and it wasn't a formal course. It was talking to other people who are doing the work. And finally, keep an ear out for news of our Discovery project on feedback literacy. We are looking to implement approaches to see if we can change feedback literacy in the long term. So that's my three things. Firstly, the shift in feedback. Secondly, what feedback literate students do. And thirdly, what feedback literate educators can do and what we can do to try and develop student feedback literacy. Thank you so much. I'd love to have a chat with you.
Thanks very much, Phil. I thought that was superb. Really great interactions. And lots for all of us to reflect on. Even conceptually, I think even in thinking about feedback across the three levels of the programme, the module and the individual student. And I'm sure many of us have made a note to look up the rest of the competency framework for your thoughts on the macro and the micro levels. I think the emphasis on feedback design also makes a lot of sense. And I really like the idea of using that design to help build assessment and feedback literacy among students. So we do have some time for questions. If people would like to enter them in the chat. We will have access to the presentation, yeah.
I'm imagining people are madly typing their questions in. This is a good one. Sorry, I'm looking at the chat. I should let you choose the ones that are most relevant to the.
Well, I suppose we'll just take them in order. Do you think we can use ChatGPT to write feedback for us?
I think we can, and it's certainly possible. Simon Buckingham-Shum and a whole bunch of other researchers, including myself, have a preprint out at the moment around sort of the use of artificial intelligence and feedback, and kind of augmenting that framework that Dave Boud and I did, but to include artificial intelligence sort of feedback literacy. So I think it's really promising. I'd say ChatGPT in particular, I'd really caution people on using that, because students submit their work to us with an understanding that it will be confidential. When we give things over to ChatGPT, they are no longer confidential in that way. We agree to certain terms of use that the student may not have. There was recently a bit of a scandal where some Samsung employees uploaded some sort of commercial in confidence material to ChatGPT and got in a lot of trouble. And I'd hate to see that happen to a well-meaning educator.
Okay. Rachel has a question. Are there any feedback templates you would recommend?
Look, templates is really interesting. So there's templates in terms of the sort of quick marks type feature on Turnitin and tools like that, where you've got kind of banks of lots of comments that you can give to students. But I'd steer people away from that and towards some other templates that exist more at the design level than the comments level. So there are things like interactive cover sheets that have been used. If you search feedback cover sheet in the literature, you'll find that there are people working on ways to make that happen. And those can be used to support the sort of practices that I was talking about. You know, a feedback cover sheet template that requires students to make a specific feedback request, for instance. So yeah, I think go out there, find templates, save yourself some time, but look at the design level.
Right. What is your view on co-creation of rubrics with students?
I think it's really interesting. So I've got a paper on rubrics in assessment and evaluation in higher education, where I say in it that I think that's something that I quite like. The term rubric, however, means a different thing to every person. And yeah, we're mandated to use rubrics at our institution, but what the people who wrote the policy don't know is that we could use the rubric mandate to do co-created rubrics with students that are holistic rather than analytic. You know, they don't have any numbers on them and they're not a tick box exercise, but something that's used for broad judgment. I think co-creation is also really good for developing student evaluative judgment, because it requires students to say, this is what I think a good one would look like. So yeah, really productive practice. Can be challenging to do because you end up with a set of ideas that's different to what you, the expert assessor, think, but yeah, really productive pedagogically.
What is your approach if there is an institutional design for feedback, but it isn't useful at all for students?
Oh gosh, I think this is really hard. One thing I've observed in assessment and feedback that is fortunately not my experience at my institution, but something a lot of people say, is that it's only through getting someone external to come in and say, this is a funny way of doing things, that things get changed. I think you can find various ways to work against it. Student organisations really care about feedback, so kind of rallying with them, getting them to support a little bit of change. But yeah, I think trying to expose colleagues to the way that it's done somewhere else and say it needn't be so here.
Thanks, really helpful. Someone's commented on just those negative emotions I think we talked about earlier. And do you have anything, I suppose, to add to kind of help students manage that? And I suppose I've mentioned here, seeing a lot of ticks in a 40 to 50% column can be very disheartening for students.
Yeah, it really can. You know, I know that in a lot of other aspects of society, when we provide people with really bad news, we have a duty of care to let them know about what the other supports are that are available. But in the context of marking and feedback, it's common practice to give someone something that's going to ruin their day or their week or their year without any support around it. So I think we need to do more around that sort of duty of care. I think if we can find ways to work that into some follow-up, or here's how you can make it better, I think it seems a bit more of a surmountable problem. Hattie talks about, some feedback is written as here's where I am, and some's about where I'm going, and we need how am I going to get there as well. Because if you just tell me what's wrong with it and you don't tell me how to get better, that's the really disheartening part.
Yeah. An issue, I suppose, is close to our hearts in QQI as well, is around feedback on placements and supporting practitioners, supporting students on placement rather than academic staff. Do you have any ideas how we might enhance feedback in those contexts?
Yeah, so I've been part of some sort of workshops to develop the assessment and feedback capabilities of people in those contexts. And what was really surprising was they actually had a bunch of useful things on their end that could improve what we were doing. So I think it's probably in partnership to try and work with those people. I think it's a real random grab bag. There's a lot of people out there in the placement world who don't provide the kind of real honest comments about student progress that they need to. We have sort of failure to fail in some contexts, but then there are also some horrible people. And when you're operating at scale, it's hard to know who's who. So I think really sort of co-design and professional development, maybe some of those support and templates. I've seen some great work on feedback moderation as well, and sort of actually looking at the feedback comments, but so many of these feedback comments in placement are ephemeral. It's the way the surgeon looked at me.
Yeah. Another really interesting one, someone's commented that I suppose a lot of what we've talked about today is appropriate for a kind of structured or formal education context. And is there a link to, suppose, more RPL, informal, non-formal learning feedback? Do you have any, suppose, thoughts or views on that?
Yeah, I wonder if the sort of business management, organizational psychology literature might be a good place to go to for that. I really do think this Thanks for the Feedback book is a great recommendation. I listened to the audio book, it was wonderful, because I think a lot of that really works in this informal context. In formal education, we have such ritualized feedback. If you submit the work, you get the formal comments, all of that. But feedback is so cyclic and constant in other contexts if we view it that way.
Okay, look, we have loads more questions here that unfortunately we're just not going to get time to. But listen, I'd just like to extend my sincere thanks to you, Philip, for your excellent presentation and for making time for us in your extremely busy itinerary. And I'm in no way surprised that you're in such high demand. I also just want to advise participants that QQI has established a Rethinking Assessment community hub on Microsoft Teams. And the aim of that is to provide opportunities for people like yourselves with an interest in assessment to network and share information on events and other developments that may be of interest. So if you'd like to join that community, I'll post a link in the chat here, or you can email us at rethinking.assessment@qqi.ie. As you mentioned, this is the first in a series of events, so please do keep an eye on our website and social media for information on future events. And we'll aim to get the recording of today's session up on QQI's YouTube channel in the next week or so. But for now, thank you all so much for your attendance and participation today in what I think you'll agree has been an excellent session. And we really look forward to engaging with you again soon on our Rethinking Assessment programme.
Thanks so much, Roisin. It's been really fun.